And I'm starting the recording again here because Gary has just said something quite shocking, really. Again. But he's gone right back to the beginning, denying that these experiments have ever been done, and he's just such a massive liar.
Kinetic energy breaks that idea. So the 10-ton train, 5-ton train does the same thing. It just breaks the whole idea of the
Which is why
conservation of
I
energy.
return to where we started, right? What experiment is possible to like put this to bed? Because you said I think 3 interactions, 3 collisions, would have doubled the energy of the initial, whatever.
Well, I guess all they have to do is prove that a spring isn't conservative. So, I mean, this was a simple experiment that they don't seem to be able to do competently, but you just shoot the 10-ton train, you know what I'm saying, the 5-ounce train. You shoot the 5-ounce train going 10 miles an hour into a spring, and then you shoot a 10-ton train going 5 miles an hour into a spring, and you see if they compress the spring the same amount. It means they weigh the same. It means they have the same momentum. It means there's no kinetic energy because you won't collect. The 5-ton train should have twice as much energy, right? If it has twice as much energy, should compress the spring twice as much.
So the 5-ton train going 10 miles an hour rather than the 10-mile train going 5 miles an hour, it should have more kinetic energy, of course.
Right, it has to compress the spring
smaller
more.
Train.
It has to compress the spring some more because it has twice as much energy, right? So that
does
simple
it?
test.
Is that how you measure?
It does compress the spring more. How many times have I shown him this now? How many times? A dozen? I've lost count how many times I've shown him. And the fact that TOADY is completely not up to speed on any of this makes this conversation completely redundant.
Kinetic energy by compressing a spring?
Well, a spring is doing weight, right? And you know that if I have 300 pounds sitting on you or I have 600 pounds on you, you know that 600 pounds is twice as much energy as 300 pounds sitting on you, right?
Wrong. No, you've got twice as much force. And this was something that Ian was explaining to me earlier because it's an aspect I have difficulty comprehending. This is the mistake I was making, thinking that putting pennies on a spring, measuring the weight, measuring the force, is the same thing as measuring the energy it would take to compress the spring that much, and it's not. The work it takes to compress the spring, it takes 4 times as much energy to compress the spring twice as much. Yeah, it takes 4 times as much work to compress the spring twice as much.
I'm just saying you can understand it's a weight argument.
Yeah, but it doesn't. The time that pressure is being exerted on the spring come into it, right?
Well, I think TOADY is beginning to smell a rat, I suppose.
Because
I know, but that's what makes springs useful. Is the fact that they're within a range. They don't care what speed. I can compress the spring.
Do they not?
I can compress the spring really
Slowly?
well. Can't you imagine me doing it really slowly and then I have a little clip that stops it right there, right?
Yeah, I can.
And then I can do it really quickly, and it's the same location. It's the same compression. It doesn't care how fast you compress it. It just says compress me a certain location, and I'll give you back a certain amount of energy. So,
Oh, then why can't we do that? That's a good experiment then. Yeah, we get 2 mass.
And why can't we do that? Over the very experiment I did a year ago, more than a year ago, last February actually. And then you're saying, why can't we do that? And I have done that. And Gary is such a massive liar. He isn't even pointing out to TOADY that Steve Bruff has done it already, but he disagrees with the method I used because I was using a lever. He knew all the time it was a lever, but he pretended for appearance's sake that he couldn't tell it was a lever. He wanted to make it sound like it was the most appalling experiment that was ever done, so that way he could reject the results of every single experiment I've done for the last year, and the years before, in fact. Which is quite strange when you consider the fact that the very first time he encountered me, he said I was doing important work and I was a sweet guy, a nice guy, and the world would be a better place if there were more Steves in the world. And all of a sudden, as soon as I start disagreeing with his so-called physics, all of a sudden Steve is a horrible person, and fuck you, he says, and good riddance to you. That's the last we'll hear of you. 4 years later, Gary, I'm still here, knocking you down because you talk so much.
We'll move them at a set speed, right? It's half of one, and we'll get it to.
I know. I sort of did half the experiment with ball bearings. Okay. Well, yeah. I mean, I used ball bearings, and
Oh yeah. Don't mention that Steve did all this a year ago. Don't bother mentioning that, Gary.
I was pushing them with the same spring. All right. So I would push one ball bearing.
All right. So that's fine.
So I used one and pushed it, and then I would use two and pushed it with the same exact compression. So I pulled back a rubber band.
Yeah, and don't you think you ought to mention to him that the surface was rough, that the track got thinner and thinner? It wasn't an evenly spaced track. You didn't demonstrate. You didn't let us see the entire experiment. You didn't let us see You didn't let us see any detail what the track was made of, because it looked very bumpy to me. How come I got the exact opposite results when I reproduced your experiment with a lot more care and detail, using a level to make sure, a spirit level to make sure the table was actually level, making absolutely dead certain that the track was actually the same width from one end to the other, making sure that the balls actually were the correct weight, and doing 4-to-1 ratio as well as 2-to-1 ratio. How come I got completely different results to you, Gary?
So to the same location, and then shot them, okay? And I got results that are close. You know what I mean? They weren't perfect, but they were close to 50. You know, when I shot two of them, they went half the velocity.
What surface did they go over?
Well, I made a little track. Like I said, it wasn't perfect. It wasn't a perfect experiment. That's why.
It wasn't perfect. It was awful. It's so far from perfect. It was meaningless.
My numbers weren't perfect, but I'm just saying I could perfect it. I could make it even.
I don't know. Can you see this device?
Whoa! Just look, he's got exactly the same device as I've been using for the last year. Isn't that hilarious? He's got exactly the same device as I've been using for the last year that Gary has been complaining about. Can't wait to hear what Gary's got to say about this. This is so funny.
You must have seen one of these before, right? Yeah. Right. So look, I got this little spring here, right? Yeah, and this little, I could do something with this, right? And can you see this?
Yeah, the only bad side is it's got a little slope on it, so you have to change it so it.
You have to change this. Well, you change the knob, right? But this goes. Look, it goes. It's always the same, right? It's got a spring. It's always the same, right? It's got a spring. It's always the same, right? It's got a spring. It's got a.
Well, you think they're always the same, but you know their quick releases are a little more complicated than you think they are.
You need to ask yourself, why is Gary lying about this ultra simple device, saying that the mechanism? Why is Gary lying that this release mechanism is complicated? It's exactly the same as his release mechanism. It's exactly the same as his release mechanism. See that little notch there? See that little notch there? That little notch there. This pin gets held back by... Gary's talking nonsense. Gary's talking nonsense. The pin is simply held back. When you press the button, this can fire forward because it's held in place by a tiny piece of wire. The pin, pressing the spring in, is held back. The pin is held back by that tiny piece of wire on the button. That's all it is. When you press the button, it can fire out. That's all it is. It's a simple pin held back. When you press the button, out it flies. That is the button you press. And Gary wants to pretend that that's a complicated mechanism. It's exactly the same as his own mechanism. It's actually less complicated than Gary's mechanism. It's actually less complicated than Gary's mechanism. This was Gary's mechanism. You have a fishing line attached to a rubber band in the middle, and the fishing line hooks over a pin. Fishing line hooks over a pin. Come on. The fishing line hooks over a pin, and then something lifts off. Yeah, knocks it off the pin. So it's the same mechanism. Try again, Steve. I'm going to do this if it kills me. Yeah. So it's the same mechanism as Gary's. It's the same mechanism as Gary's. It's essentially the same mechanism as Gary's, where the elastic band is held by a piece of fishing wire wrapped around a pin, and then something knocks it off the pin. Like that. Pretty much the same mechanism, just more reliable than Gary's. Well, that is wrapped around that little groove. This was the original. I've taken this out. The original was made out of steel, but I've removed it to make it lighter. So Gary's trying to pretend it's a complicated mechanism. Ask yourself, Toady, ask yourself, ladies and gentlemen, why is Gary lying that it's a complicated mechanism? It's simply this. little tiny piece of wire held against that little ledge there. Then when you press the button, off it goes. So it's held against there when the spring is compressed. Then when you press the button, it's released and it can lurch forward. Nothing more complicated than that. Garbage. You're talking absolute nonsense. If TOADY is thinking of using this solder socket as a release mechanism, what he needs to bear in mind is you need to take out some components. Well, I've replaced that steel rod with an acrylic rod with a notch etched into it the same, yes. And also you can change the spring. You can put a variety of springs in. Depends on what you require. This isn't the original spring. This is a weaker one. And oops, there you go. And you have to remove, message to TOADY, you have to remove the seal that goes around that, because that's a piston. And the point of that piston is to pump air, well, to suck air through the nozzle. Suck air through that nozzle, yes. Now, if you don't remove that, it will slow it down considerably. It's just such a ridiculous, simple mechanism. So there you go. It's just spring loaded, little spring inside there, and it catches on that latch when you put it in. Gary, for some reason, wants to lie to you that it's a complicated mechanism when it couldn't be simpler. It could not be simpler. I've used acrylic because it's lighter than that, so you're not pushing that mass on top of whatever other mass you're launching. Gary talks complete and utter nonsense. Gary was talking complete and utter nonsense. There was nothing complicated about that mechanism. It was just Gary who wanted to pretend it was, because he knows that for a year I've been using that as my launch mechanism, one of my main launch mechanisms, solder socket. And he doesn't want TOADY to start thinking he can use the same one. He can. There's nothing wrong with it, so long as you take those precautions. Remove the piston ring and try and lighten the components if you can. Just modify it for that particular purpose. They're cheap enough. You can also use Bic pens, they're fine too. Depends what you're trying to do with it. It's ridiculous that Gary is trying to put people off doing experiments with things that are perfectly adequate. Does Gary think that laboratories have different springs? Does he think that putting a white coat on makes you more intelligent, makes you do the experiment more diligently?
Oh, are they?
Well, yeah.
No, they're not. Gary hasn't got a clue. They're not complicated. It's exactly the same mechanism as Gary used on his elastic band release. It's simply a little thing, a little hook that pulls off.
Found
Push this quickly.
Yeah.
Oh, maybe.
There are a tiny bit, there is some fluctuation in them.
Oh, there is.
I've never heard anything so ridiculous in my life as a person pressing a button saying, oh, it's going faster, or it's going slower. How do you know? You don't have bionic eyes. If it was going faster or slower, then you're blocking up the nozzle on the end, because it's a solder socket. If you block up the nozzle on the end, maybe without thinking of what you're doing, then yes, you will slow it down without thinking. Or if it's got some little bits of solder still stuck in it, they can slow it down. Honest, it's as reliable. I've used it on the digital timer measuring in thousandths of a second, and it repeatedly comes out with exactly the same result, down to a thousandth of a second. And you, with your bionic eyes, think you can tell the difference. And Gary, who's never even looked at the mechanism of one, otherwise he would know it was a simple mechanism, wants to put you off using one. He wants to lie that they are unsuitable, because I've used it successfully, proving him wrong time and time and time again, because he's an idiot. He is an idiot.
Yeah, if I push it, you're right. If I push it quite quickly, it tends to go way quicker.
I
Rubbish, rubbish, absolute rubbish.
I used a clothespin. I had to put a little pin through it, and then that went around a piece
I
of
thought
fish.
I had an ideal little thing that I could rig up with a little ball in a little runway.
I'm just saying.
You could, and I did, and he's not telling you. He doesn't want you to know. That's why. Yes, you could, TOADY. You could, but you have to dismantle your solder socket. You have to take the bits out of it, and you have to change some of the parts.
What I've learned is this: you have to really. There's little subtleties to all the engineering, and that's why it should be done with people with lab coats.
Did he just say why it has to be done with people who have coats? Did he mean white coats, or have I misheard what he said? Is he serious? Does he think that if you've got a white coat, you have a different spring, or the spring behaves differently because you've got a dicky bow on? I have a dicky bow. I'll get a white coat if that's what it takes. Moron.
It should be done with people that
It should be done with people
who can
proper
control
mechanisms.
all of these little variables that can
Yeah, 'cause they
screw
matter.
everything
Yeah.
up.
So why are we listening to you, Gary, talking about your absolutely incredibly rubbish experiments, where you couldn't even be bothered making a track that was parallel? It was half an inch. It was half inch one end, and it was quarter inch the width the other end. You could see it was a different width. It was bumpy as anything. It was like you made it out of cardboard. Absolute junk, and the release mechanism was junk. No wonder you got results that differ from the scientific results, because your experiment was junk, Gary. And yet here you are being a hypocrite only because TOADY's come out with an implement, a launch mechanism that I've been using for a year. You didn't want to be embarrassed about that, did you? No. And yet that doesn't count for Gary, does he? Well, have you noticed how when Gary does these experiments, none of that counts at all, does it? No, Gary's crappy experiment counts for the world, doesn't it? This is the second time he's quoted his crappy experiment that even he admits is crappy. Doesn't stop him quoting it, does it?
You know, because ideally, like I say, when I did the ballistic pendulum, you know, if I could solder a couple little eye rings on the piece of metal to make sure it can't oscillate back and forth, and run a piece of fishing line. You know what I'm saying? I'm just saying it ends up being a lot of work. You know, you got to fiddle with all these little pieces to get everything
all these
right.
little things together, and the more complex you make it, the more variables you're introducing.
You know, and it's in the middle of your living room. You know, so I mean, you know. But I just mean that I wish, you know, I mean, we should be able to get a physicist somewhere that can do these experiments. Or I'm just saying, one of the tinkerers out there, all these guys doing the free energy experiments, you know, one of them.
Ding, 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 hypocrite alert, hypocrite alert. Oh, you only just finished saying that we need professionals to do these experiments. The next minute he's saying, no, what we need is these free energy nuts. He wants the tinfoil hatters to do it, the people who think there is free energy, like himself, I suppose. In other words, Gary doesn't give a monkey's. Gary doesn't care one iota who does the experiment, so long as they agree with him. If it's somebody in a white coat who agrees with him, great. If it's somebody in a white coat who doesn't agree with him, they're idiots. Those are the people he's disagreeing with all the time. If it's somebody who's doing an experiment in their living room who agrees with him, great, he's a tinkerer, one of the free energy nuts. If he thinks they're disproving the kinetic energy theory, that's all well and good by him. But if it's somebody who's disproving Gary and doing it diligently, he doesn't like that one bit, does he? Because he's a hypocrite. He's a massive, massive coward and a hypocrite and a liar. An absolute liar. Cheat and a liar.
Yeah, let's get somebody to do this real experiment, you know, instead of doing all those fake ones. You know. It is frustrating.
It is frustrating.
It's doubly frustrating for us to have to listen to two complete idiots talking utter garbage. One of them lying, another one completely ignorant about the story so far. I've never seen anything so pathetic in my entire life. I really haven't. It's a clown show.
Alright. My head's done in now.
Yeah.
You've got some nerve. How do you think we feel having to listen to this claptrap?